West Coast in what is today British Columbia. In this lesson 6, we are going to start talking about how Canada became its own country and no longer a part of the British Empire. And to do that, we're going to return to what is now the eastern part of the country, places like Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, the Maritimes, and we're going to pick up from right after the American Revolution. So let's get started. So you can check your lesson 5 notes to help you review and to fit this in. The 2 colonies in what is now British Columbia were first known as Blank Island and Blank Caledonia. They were controlled by Britain and began to grow quickly after the Blank Rush. So I invite you to pause the video now, go check your lesson 5 notes and fill them in. We've got, they're first known as Vancouver Island and New Caledonia. And they were controlled by Britain, and they began to grow quickly after the Gold Rush. What North America looks like after the American Revolution is over. So before you had what is now the United States, was controlled by Britain, except for kind of this western part and the southern part down here, which is controlled by Spain. And then you have all of this part of what is now eastern Canada and parts of like central Canada that are also controlled by Britain. And then after, what ends up happening is you have Britain has the northern part, which is now Canada, and the United States has this part down here, and it's its own independent country, so it's not ruled by Britain anymore. But we've talked before about how many people who lived in what's now the United States fled as refugees up to what is now Canada as loyalists, because they wanted to stay loyal to Britain instead of joining this new independent country. And you can see over here, you know, this area where we live is still, you know, the British haven't arrived. Captain Cook, Captain Cook and those other folks, they've come by, but they haven't actually started any colonies. So the Spanish, the Russians, the British are all kind of around there, but nobody has had any colonies. And there's very few European people in what is now the west coast of North America at that point. So in the years following the American Revolution, the French Canadiens and the British Loyalist settlers were worried that the Americans would try to invade Canada and bring it into the United States. And invade is a verb. It means to enter a place with soldiers and military force. So the Americans, you know, they had this idea that maybe they would take over the entirety of North America and make it one independent country. And many French Canadiens didn't want that because they were being tolerated quite well by the British. They were allowed to practice their Catholic religion, to speak French, all this sort of thing, to keep their traditions. And they were worried that if the Americans took over, that'd be taken from them. And the Loyalists didn't want that because the Loyalists, you know, they fled the United States precisely because they didn't want to live in that country. They wanted to stay in Canada. They wanted to stay within the British Empire. So a lot of Canadiens and Loyalists didn't want that to happen. Now, in 1812, there were some arguments between the British and the United States, and they kind of boiled over. They got really intense. And the USA ends up declaring war. And this became known as the War of 1812, a very original name, especially because it continued from 1812 to 1815. So during this war, the British government was distracted by another war they were in with the French Empire back in Europe. This meant that the British couldn't send many troops to defend Canada, and we had to also rely on militias and our First Nations allies. And what a militia is when you get a bunch of ordinary people, you know, in a crisis to become soldiers. So you get farmers and doctors and lawyers and, you know, miners and just regular people to go take their guns and fight off the Yankees. Because that's basically what was happening in Canada at that time, because the British couldn't send over very many soldiers because they were distracted by a war back in Europe. So the Americans thought that they would win the war easily. Their plan, they thought, you know, it will be so easy. And it kind of made sense that they thought that because there were a lot more Americans. The United States was much more powerful than Canada. There were way more Americans than Canadians. And they had a much larger army. They had a lot. The USA had a population about 10 times the size of British North America, and far more soldiers in North America. US President Thomas Jefferson said that taking over Canada would be a mere matter of marching. He was wrong. Now I'm going to show you a cool video. So 1812, you think about it, it only took place well, I mean, it took place more than 200 years ago, but 2012, there was it was the 200th anniversary, and so the government produced this video to kind of remind Canadians of that time that we were able to fight off the Americans. Because if you hadn't guessed, we won the war, right? Canada is still an independent country. It's not controlled by the United States. So clearly, we won.
200 years ago, the United States invaded our territory. But we defended our land. We stood side by side. And won the fight for Canada. Learn more about the War of 1812. Visit 1812.gc.ca. A message from the Government of Canada.
Well, it's kind of a cool video just to show, how many people kind of work together to defend our country. At the time, it wasn't even an independent country. It was still part of the British It was still part of British North America. It was still part of the British Empire. But these people, they didn't want to be taken over by the Americans, so they fought them off. Now, I'm going to tell you about a few heroes of the war that I think are really cool. So one of them is Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh was a Shawnee chief, so he's indigenous, and he was trying to save his people from being forced from their land to make way for American settlers. He fought for the British because he thought they would protect his people's rights more than the Americans would. He helped the British win the Battle of Detroit by tricking the Americans into surrendering. And we'll watch in a minute a video about this Battle of Detroit because it's kind of incredible that they were able to basically trick the Americans into surrendering, even though there were very few Indigenous and Canadian and British soldiers fighting against the Americans. And Isaac Brock was a British general, and his job was basically to organize ordinary people into militias that worked with the British soldiers to fight off the Americans. And there's a town in Ontario called Brockville that's named after him. There's also a university, Brock University in Niagara. So here's a little bit on the Battle of Detroit, which I just think is one of the best stories of this whole war.
In July 1812, General Hull assembled an army for what looked to be an invincible invasion sent from Detroit. General Brock had only one hope to stop the American invasion: help from the native warriors.
We are committed to a war in which the enemy will always surpass us in numbers, equipment, and resources. It is of primary importance that the confidence and goodwill of the Indians be preserved.
During the American Revolution, most Native Americans had allied themselves with the British, a decision that cost them lives and land.
The British understood that without Native allies, they would have a very difficult time. But because of our losses during the Revolutionary War, our people were very hesitant to fight. When we put ourselves in the moccasins of these fellows back then, what big decisions ahead? What side to pick? What fight to make? And where to make that fight? They're big, big decisions.
But after the burning of Prophetstown, Tecumseh had made his choice. Late one August evening, he entered Brock's quarters on the Canadian side of the Detroit River. The two men liked each other on sight.
A more sagacious and gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. Tecumseh has the admiration of everyone who conversed with him.
They've both been professional, full-time soldiers, basically, in their culture since they've been teenagers. Isaac Brock's older brother had been killed during the American Revolution as a British officer. And Tecumseh's older brother had been killed, and his father as well, fighting Americans.
All of Brock's officers urged caution. Tecumseh pushed for an immediate attack. Brock agreed. "This is a man," Tecumseh said of Brock. On the morning of August 15th, 1812, they crossed the river and took up positions around Fort Detroit. The Americans sat safely behind walls 11 feet high, but the audacious Brock sent General Hull a demand. "I require," he wrote, your immediate surrender. Hull was tortured by doubt.
He had an inordinate fear of the Indians. He was convinced that the Indians were savages beyond any recognition as human beings, that if they were unleashed on his family or his troops, it would be the worst kind of massacre.
Brock dressed Canadian militiamen in surplus uniforms, so they looked like regulars. Tecumseh marched his same men past the fort 3 times, so it looked as if he had thousands of warriors. Then the British primed the cannon.
The British gave notice that they would commence a bombardment of Detroit. When it began, Lydia Bacon, who was the wife of an American Army officer, was actually in the fort. She was in the hospital quarters with other women preparing bandages for the wounded. The British got the range of the fort so well that a shell came through the next door room and killed 2 officers outright.
Lydia Bacon. The cannon began to roar. A 24-pound shot cut 2 officers who were standing in the entry directly in 2. The same ball passed through the wall and took the legs off of 1 man. My feelings were wrought up to a high pitch. But weep I could not, complain I would not.
William Hull did not have Lydia Bacon's courage. The American general disintegrated.
In the fort, there was Hull slumped on the ground, drinking heavily, smoking, tobacco juice and spittle running down the front of his uniform. His men are so angry. They haven't fired a shot.
Hull begged for time. He sent a note to Brock, asking for a 3-day ceasefire.
Shadrach Byfield. I was with General Brock at that time, and from what we could hear, the American general inside the fort wanted 3-day cessation, to which our general replied that if they did not yield in 3 hours, he would blow up every one of them.
Hull didn't need 3 hours. After a few minutes, he ordered a white tablecloth hung out a window. It was the only time in history that a white flag was raised over an American city before a foreign army.
So I show you that video just because I think it's really interesting to see how the British and the First Nations were able to work together to fight off the Americans and to kind of even trick them into surrendering at that Battle of Fort Detroit. And obviously, you know, war is a terrible thing and people died and it's bad and it's, you know, not something to be celebrated. But I think what is to be celebrated is kind of the alliance that they were able to have between the Indigenous and the British that was happening kind of at the beginning of our country. At the beginning of even before our country was a country, and how we were able to use, you know, at various battles like that to protect our country from and not make it part of the United States. Here's another hero of the War of 1812, Laura Secord. So she was a British settler, and her family owned a farm near Niagara. She overheard that the Americans had a plan for an attack, and so she ran through the woods, like I think it was like 20 kilometers or so, to tell the British and First Nations fighters, give them kind of notice so they were able to fight to survive the surprise attack. And it wasn't a surprise attack, so they were able to win.
In June of 1813, Laura Secord overheard the secret plans of the American soldiers in occupation.
If you raise your sword against Fitzgibbon, Upper Canada will be broken.
How many men can we muster?
500 infantry, battery of artillery, my dragoons. Fitzgibbon can't manage more than 50 men, small band of natives. Not a serious resistance if you're equal to the enterprise.
Pursue the advance 2 days hence.
Take me to Fitzgibbon. Laura Secord delivered her message to the Canadian troops. The Kahnawake Mohawks forced the surrender of 500 Yankee soldiers, and the American invasion was stopped.
So it's interesting there that also we've got like, a woman, at a time when you're not having many women involved in war, that she is, heroically going to kind of act as a spy to help the Canadians, and the Indigenous people win that battle. Here's another great kind of hero of the war. This gentleman here is Richard Pierpoint, and he was a black loyalist. And if you remember, those were the people that the British had said, okay, if you run away from your masters in the south and come up to the north, then, if you fight on behalf of the British during the American Revolution, then you'll be free. And so he did that, and then he came up to Canada, and he was a free man. And so he worried that if the Americans won, he'd be forced back into slavery. And he was like, no, I am not doing that. So he organized a black militia to help fight them off.
When he was only 16, Richard Pierpoint was enslaved in Senegal and taken to America.
All us men have sworn on this petition to fight.
You're an old man. The British Army has militias and trained soldiers.
I fought with the British during the American Revolution.
Take your land and farm it. Leave the Americans to us.
With respect, sir. I was born a free man, and I intend to die one. Your officers fight for land and money. I fight for my freedom.
Richard Pierpoint was one of thousands of black loyalists who won their freedom in the American Revolution. 30 years later, at the age of 68, he petitioned for an all-black unit that would defend Upper Canada during the War of 1812.
One other kind of key battle in the War of 1812 is this one. And if you look at it, you can probably tell what building this is. So this is an important building in the US government. This is called the White House, and it's where the president lives and kind of has his offices. And the Americans, during the war, one of the things they were able to do is burn down Toronto. And they basically burnt down the whole city. And so the British, to get back at them, they sent a ship down to Washington, D.C., and they briefly kind of invaded, burned down the White House, and they got out of there before the Americans could kind of fight them off. So that's kind of one of the crowning achievements of the war from the perspective of the British. So in 1815, the British and the Americans signed a treaty, and that's like a deal, an agreement, to restore the peace. The Americans had not conquered Canada, which was still part of the British Empire. We won! Or did we? So many Americans, I've given you the Canadian perspective so far, and honestly, that's the perspective that I hold, but I'm going to tell you their perspective. So many Americans will say they won the War of 1812. Some call it the Second War of Independence. Now, here are their reasons. The USA was bigger than Canada, but it was smaller than the entire British Empire. So the USA thinks of themselves at this point as kind of being a small country compared to Britain, which was still much more powerful. And the USA had a smaller military than Britain, if you're counting the entire British Empire around the world. So that's kind of their perspective, and it's not my perspective, it's a different one. And what this tells us kind of about history and what we're doing in this class is, different people and different groups have different perspectives on the same historical events. And what the goal of a historian is, somebody who studies this, so you guys right now are being historians, they're trying to find the most right perspective and to think about, okay, well, these people see it this way, these people see it this way. Where is the truth in there? Is one side more right than the other? And so they talk about that and they argue about it and they do all sorts of research into kind of books and documents to try and understand what actually happened as best we can. And I will say that in this video, I'm portraying the Americans and the British as being kind of absolute enemies, and that is no longer true. This is a video when the British Prime Minister, this gentleman over here, his face I'm circling, visited the United States when President Obama was still president.
It's now been 200 years since the British came here to the White House under somewhat different circumstances. They made quite an impression. They really lit up the place.
I am a little embarrassed as I stand here
to think that 200 years ago, my ancestors tried to burn this place down. Now, looking around me, I can see you've got the place a little better defended today. You're clearly not taking any risks with the Brits this time.
So, you know, Britain and the United States are certainly not enemies. Although they're not just not enemies. Canada and the United States are not enemies. In fact, we're probably the closest allies of any two countries, maybe in history. And I'm going to show you an example of that. If you look down here, you'll see this arch. And you may have seen it before if you've ever driven down to the border through the Peace Arch border crossing. And this is a famous monument that was built in 1914, about 100 years after the War of 1812, in order to kind of commemorate it, and to express the fact that Canada and the US had become close friends. And as countries, we never wanted to, you know, get into a battle again. And what it says on top is children of a common mother. And what they're referring to there is the fact that both Britain and Canada have this connection, or excuse me, both the United States and Canada have this connection back to Britain. That's our common mother. And then on the other side, it says, brethren dwelling together in unity, which means brothers living together in unity, like that we're united on a lot of things. Like the United States is a democracy. The United States has the same kind of economy we do. Many of us have families in the United States. I lived 2 years of my life in the US. You guys probably go over there pretty often to visit with friends and family. And Americans do the same thing, right, with Canadians. And then what it says over here is it says, may these gates never be closed. And so there's gates in the middle, and the idea is that we never want to be in a situation where we would close our gates with the United States because they are our, you know, best friend as far as other countries around the world. In any case, I want to pick up the story with, you know, in the years after that war was done, so after 1815, the people in the British colonies felt a greater sense of what's called unity. Like they felt like they were coming together. People started talking about joining all of the British colonies in North America into one country. The United States was growing, but so was Canada. Many Irish people left their country to escape the Great Potato Famine, and thousands of them settled in Canada. So the population of Canada was growing because a lot of people were coming over here to kind of escape and to build a new life for themselves. And I'm going to show you this kind of video of some immigrants to Canada from Ireland.
Molly Johnson.
In the 1850s, many Quebec families adopted Irish orphans, their parents dead of ship's fever on the Atlantic crossing.
Alors Molly, voici ton nouveau père et ta nouvelle mère. Dorénavant, tu porteras le nom fier et historique de Bélanger. Tu es maintenant une petite Canadienne, Molly.
No, we have to keep our Irish name. Mon mère me l'a dit juste avant de sa mort. We have to pour la mémoire de mon patrie.
Ça, monseigneur, ça me paraît tout à fait acceptable.
Quel est ton nom, mon enfant?
Johnson, Sir Molly Johnson.
Et comment t'appelles-tu, toi?
Patrick O'Neill.
Et toi?
Kathleen Ryan.
A century and a half later, many of those names still resound in Quebec.
So you can see there that you've got these Irish immigrants to Canada. You know, they were coming across on these boats, and these boats were often crowded, and there was disease, and people would pass away. And often, you know, the parents would pass away on the boat, and their children would be orphans. And one of the kind of amazing little stories of kind of our history is that when they came over, they were often adopted by people who spoke French, by people who were not Irish and who didn't speak the same language. And so these little boys and girls who were from Ireland got adopted by French Canadians. And normally, you know, you would change your last name to your new adoptive family. But what the French Canadian mother shows in this thing is tolerance again, right? That, you know, we say, hey, we're going to adopt you into our family, but you don't need to change your last name. You can keep that part of your heritage, part of who you are. And I like to think that we, you know, as a country have kind of managed to do that even today. So, picking up our story, elected politicians began to dream of a country that would stretch from sea to sea. So from the Pacific all the way to the Atlantic and back again, and then all the way up to the Arctic. But could they compromise and bring people together from such different backgrounds? Now, compromise means trying to find an answer in the middle. If you want one thing and I want the other, can we somehow agree on something in the middle? And could they build a country when the population was spread out over such a huge territory, right? Like, our country is the second biggest in the world. It's so huge. And so could they do it? You know? So in 1864, the Fathers of Confederation met to begin negotiations in Charlottetown, the capital of Prince Edward Island. And by 1867, they were ready to ask Great Britain to make Canada an independent dominion. So we were going to say, you know what, we're British North America, and we're going to ask Britain to allow us to be an independent country. And, you know, so unlike the Americans, we didn't go fight Britain, we just asked for it. And in fact, we were given it, and that's why we are an independent country of Canada today. Although, to be clear, many people still thought of themselves as British and Canadian at the same time. So we were an independent country, but within the British Empire. And you can see that even in the name of it, like our province, for example, British Columbia, that it, you know, has got that connection back to Britain. Now, these two gentlemen down here are two of the most important figures in the creation of Canada, just politically. This guy on the left, his name is Sir John A. Macdonald, and he was the leader of the Conservative Party in what's today Ontario, and he became Canada's first Prime Minister. And this is his ally, Georges-Étienne Cartier, and he was the leader of the Conservatives in Quebec, the Parti Bleu. And him came together with one of the Liberal leaders as well, and they helped to build our country, helped to pass the laws and get everyone kind of on board to build our country. I'll show you two videos about these guys.
Careful, that champagne cost a fortune.
Mr. MacDonald, do you plan to bribe the entire delegation?
Our methods may differ, Mr. Brown, but our objective is the same.
My objective, sir, is honest talk.
And mine is to win.
Gentlemen, enough. We must convince the Maritimes or there will be no confederation.
Aye, George. Today, civil war grips America. How long before they look to our borders again?
Separated, the colonies are isolated and weak.
But united. Just imagine. To the east, Atlantic provinces, then Upper and Lower Canada, across the prairies to the Rockies and beyond. A new country made one by a railway from sea to sea. Gentlemen, the time for union is now. I ask you to take the dare!
The Charlottetown Conference set Confederation in motion. On July 1st, 1867, Sir John A. Macdonald became Canada's first Prime Minister.
So that's Sir John A. Macdonald, and then here's his ally, Georges-Étienne Cartier.
For Sir Georges-Étienne Cartier, the work of uniting Canada was as vast as the country itself. First, he won over Quebec.
Union is the only way forward.
No, Monsieur Cartier! Confederation will cost French Canadians their nationality.
Monsieur, together we will form a political nationality independent of our origins.
Diversity will be Canada's strength.
Then he fought for Manitoba.
The Northwest has formed a government under Louis Riel. We will not join Confederation unless our rights are respected. So you want a new province? Then you'll have it. There will be a place for your people in Canada.
He envisioned a country from Atlantic to Pacific.
British Columbia won't even think of joining Canada without a wagon road through the Rockies.
Ask for a railway. We are building a country, after all.
Bold as a lion, Confederation could not have happened but for him. The Canada, son pays, ses amours.
So those two men were really central to the creation of Canada at the beginning. John A. Macdonald and Georges-Étienne Cartier. So, on July 1st, 1867, the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia joined Confederation to form the Dominion of Canada. The first Prime Minister was Sir John A. Macdonald, a Conservative who immigrated from Scotland to Kingston, Ontario. The capital city of the new country was Ottawa, Ontario. All the other provinces, including British Columbia, remained British colonies and territories. They would join Confederation later. And so I'll end you off here with this map of what Canada looked like in 1867. Really not very much. You've got basically Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And these four provinces were kind of the very beginning of our country. But Newfoundland, up here to Manitoba, and the entire way to the west. as well as Prince Edward Island, were not yet part of Confederation. So next week, when we pick up with this, we'll start talking about how Canada expanded to the west. How did British Columbia join Confederation? How did, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, all these places join Confederation and make our country as big and as huge and as great as it is today? But I will leave it for now.